you look back through British history the last couple of 100 years, yes, there have been turbulent times, of course, but there's never been anything like this, 7 changes of prime minister in 10 years. Even in decades where there have been more frequent general elections, the leaders of the parties have stayed the same. So you've had fewer people actually in number 10. I mean, just an extraordinary shake-up. And lots of people have made the comparison with Italy. Suddenly we're doing well in football, but changing prime ministers every 5 minutes. And they're not even in the World Cup, but finally have some sort of political stability. So I think that's quite interesting. But I think the whole thing is indicative of what's going on in politics as a whole. And I think there are a number of factors that have led into this instability that's given Andy Burnham his chance. I think it'll be a very brief chance. I think he'll be popular for a few months because he is a good communicator. He's very charismatic. He's obviously very personable. He's obviously good at human relationships. He's been Manchester mayor for a long time. He's been in politics for a long time. He's obviously got a good family life and, all these kind of things. So he's an admirable person. Don't get me wrong. I think he's going to be automatically a better leader than Keir Starmer, who is deeply unsuited to the role. But I think that turbulence isn't going to go away because certainly since Brexit, the main parties have been divided along lines that aren't really traditionally left-right. So both main parties have become ungovernable. There isn't a majority for anything. And so I think Andy Burnham, for all his talent and charisma, is going to find himself in exactly the same position as Keir Starmer, as Rishi Sunak, as Liz Truss, as Boris Johnson, as Theresa May. I mean, even going back to David Cameron, really, the parties are divided, they're ungovernable, and so they are going to change leader in the hope of trying to stay on the treadmill of politics.
That's a really useful way to kick off. I think that's a very apt description of what we're going through. Would you say that the problem in politics is the politics can't quite live up to the expectations of the electorate, I guess? Because you mentioned Brexit there, and we do seem to have had turmoil since Brexit. Of course, the Ramonas put it down to the fact that Brexit itself is a destabilizing idea, whereas it seems to me that we've not had a party leader yet who could make good on Brexit and achieve the aspirations of ordinary Brits, many of whom want, obviously to leave the European Union, which we've done, but also to have secure borders, to be a proper independent state again. All those ideas have been swirling around for some time, and we've not really had a leader that's able to live up to them. And it doesn't look like Andy Burnham will either, I think.
No, and I think the reason for that is that power no longer rests in Parliament and in number 10, or certainly not as much as it did before the Blairite reforms. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems as well that's leading to this instability, which is that everybody knows that Britain is broken. We look at things as diverse as HS2. I mean, how insane that we've spent these tens of billions of pounds on a project, where even very comparable neighbours like France can build infrastructure still. And they've got many of the same problems as we have, but they can still do that. Or the small boats. I've just been having lunch with somebody whose ancestor was one of the admirals that fought alongside Nelson. And you think about what would Nelson say about our inability to stop small inflatable dinghies from arriving on this island. And the state seems incompetent and impotent. And I think that's because there no longer is that power in Parliament. So we look to the Prime Minister and say, why can't you sort this out? Of course, the Prime Minister can't sort that out because we have all these weeds of legislation and quangos that make it impossible for any one person or even Parliament to bring change. So then, of course, the MPs look at their inboxes, they look at the polls and say, oh, well, this Prime Minister, this leader is not very effective. We better change. But it's the system that's the problem and not the Prime Minister. I think the other problem we have is an economic one, which is that because we are so deeply in debt, we are so in hock to the bond market. Sorry, Andy Burnham. But actually, to get us out of trouble, we are going to have to spend on some infrastructure. But we can no longer do that by borrowing. We no longer have any headroom in our budget. The only option is cuts, unless we want total economic crisis. But MPs, and I think more importantly, the public, are not willing to wear those cuts because we've been living in this fantasy land since the 1970s that has told us that governments can basically spend what they like with no consequence. And those chickens are coming home to roost.
They are indeed. You mentioned state incompetence. I did want to ask you about that because on so many issues now, I see that problem, state incompetence, the incapacity or even the unwillingness of our rather sclerotic state to sort certain problems out. I was in Makerfield prior to the by-election. That's obviously where Burnham won his by-election, and apparently he won a mandate to run the whole country. That was a surprise to many of us. But almost everyone I spoke to in Makerfield talked about the problem off small boats, off the borders. Of course, they would be written off as racist and xenophobes by the chattering classes, but what they were concerned about was the inability of the state that governs their country to determine the shape of the country, to police the borders, to say who can come here, who can't come here. I think the political class still doesn't understand how important an issue that is for lots of people up and down the country. The fact that we don't seem to have control over the territory itself, never mind the future of the country.
Absolutely. And if you look at the numbers now, I think we're up to around 200,000 people have come across illegally since the small boat crisis started. Of course, we had people coming across in lorries before that. 200,000 people whose identities we don't know, many of whom are now lost in the system. The Home Office doesn't even know where they are. If that's not a national security crisis, I don't know what is. And I think there's lots of talk about the unfairness of asylum seekers being given spaces in hotels. And of course, that is a legitimate concern. But I think the much, much deeper concern is the national security one. And I think what it points to is how Liberals particularly have just abandoned all understanding of human nature. They think everybody deep down from across the world, whatever culture you're from, is fundamentally good and is fundamentally going to act for altruistic reasons or for the good of their family. They'd only do something illegal like turn up in a boat on our shores if it was really, really desperate. But of course, that's not how human beings work at all. If there's a loophole, if there's a way of gaining advantage, people will do it. Not everybody, of course, but lots of people will. And I think our ancestors, previous generations, understood this, that firm borders and laws that were enforced every single time was actually a fair and compassionate way to run society. And sure, there are individual losers from that kind of system. If you break the rules and get punished very, very severely, for example, we used to have capital punishment, then clearly you have lost out in that system. But overall, having a deterrent that's always fairly and evenly applied is the only way to ensure that most people behave well most of the time. And if you allow people to turn up in our country to get benefits and stay here forever, then you should not be surprised that they keep coming. And I think Liberals have forgotten this. And they're still saying, oh, but most of these people are really fleeing war and persecution. And most of these people deserve our compassion. But, I have no idea how many of people are fleeing war and compassion. That's not the point. We've got a loophole. People are exploiting it because that's human nature. Until we understand human nature again and are willing to put boundaries in place, we're not going to solve this problem. But you could say exactly the same thing about so many of the debates that we've been really blind on. Trans, for example. Our ancestors understood there were men and there were women. And if you want to keep women safe, you have to have places where men are not allowed to go. End of story. It's just human nature. But in forgetting those natural things, those basic things, and being too squeamish to enforce the boundaries, we have invited chaos into our nation.
Yeah, the collapse of boundaries is such a recurring theme in modern Britain. The boundaries around the country, the boundaries around women-only spaces. I mean, it is a kind of psychotic levels of cultural moral relativism. One more thing on the immigration question. I wanted to ask you, because I think about this a lot and I don't have any obvious answers to it myself, but I wanted to ask you about the Boris wave, to mention a former leader of the party that you were an MP for. Lots of people are talking about the Boris wave because obviously that's not small boats, that's not illegal immigrants in that sense, but it is a very significant number of people who came to this country over the past 5 years or so. There's a lot of discussion about what should be done with them. Shabama Mahmood has been talking about making it harder for them to stay permanently. Reform and other parties are suggesting they should be invited to leave this country and go home. It does seem to be a difficult topic and one that people are worried about but not sure what we might do about. What's your view on that layer of immigration, which was huge numbers that came over the past few years?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question because two things, there's a clash here, isn't there, of both a desire to reverse that mistake and to not want to see the Boris wave, the mass migration is irreversible. I think, that is a really, really difficult thing to come to terms with, the fact that our country might never be the same again because of a mistake. that politicians made. But then also staying true to what it means to be British, which is to treat everybody equally under the rule of law, to respect citizenship, even if we don't agree with how that's been given. And I think those 2 points are clashing at the moment, and that's why we're getting this very heated debate on the right. So personally, I think that anyone who doesn't already have a British passport should not get leave to remain unless they are, a high-skilled, high-wage immigrant. And even then, it probably should be a time-limited visa, and it should be a lot harder to get citizenship. And I think Shabana Mahmood should absolutely push through with her ILR reforms. It's disappointing that they're not already enacted, because we are starting to see the first tranche, if you like, of the Boris wave able to claim that ILR. So I absolutely think that we should push ahead with those reforms, and we should not be giving out any more passports. But when it comes to people who have already gained citizenship, I think that is a different question. And yes, we might say, you and I might say, those people have been given citizenship in error. They should never have been given passports. But if we fundamentally want to adhere to the British value of treating people as citizens equally under the law, then I think in a way we would be gaining the world and losing our soul by trying to kick those people out. And I think we just have to accept that some mistakes cannot be mended. And those people are here to stay if they already have passports. And actually, our focus should turn to how do we recreate a sense of common identity, common nationhood, a common culture that yes, immigration has eroded, but it started long before then. We lost our sense of what does it mean to be British. Do we commonly understand our history? Do we even know our history? Do we celebrate regular feasts and festivals like other countries still do? If you go to places of Eastern Europe, even France, secular France, they still have festivals where everybody knows what their role is, what it means to be French. We have none of that. We could recreate that in theory if we wanted to, if we were determined enough, and then, bring people who are recently arrived but do have British passports along with us. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to recreate the Britain that existed before immigration. But personally, I think we would be losing so much of what our civilizational history means if we kicked out people with passports. I don't think that would be the right thing to do.